If you look at the ad blockers that support acceptable ads, so not all of those ad blockers in that 70 to 80% support acceptable ads, but if you look at just the ones who do support it, their opt-out rates are extremely low, usually around 6 to 8%. So what we see is that if an ad blocker adopts acceptable ads as the default, about 92 to 94% of users leave it on because they're not that bothered by the experience.
Hi, everyone. It's Wednesday, June 9th. Thanks for listening to the Behind the Numbers ad platform, an eMarketer podcast made possible by VTEX. I'm your host, Principal Analyst Nicole Perrin, and this is my platform to talk about advertising with some of the smartest and most interesting people I know. Joining me to do that today is Marty Krátky-Katz, who is co-founder and CEO at Blockthrough. Hi, Marty. How's it going?
Hi, Nicole. Doing great. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. So we're going to be talking later on about ad blocking and ad avoidance and consumer attitudes toward advertising. But first, we'll talk about you a little bit and Blockthrough as well to set up the show a little bit with my quick fire opening question. So first, let's talk a little more about Blockthrough. Can you tell listeners about what kinds of companies are your clients and what's the main problem that you're trying to help them solve?
Yeah, for sure. So Blockthrough is the most widely adopted ad block monetization solution in the world. We work with hundreds of tier 1 and tier 2 publishers, including over 25 of the top 100 publishers in the US by reach. So companies like Healthline, AccuWeather, et cetera. Our product helps these publishers monetize their ad block users in a respectful way. What that means is that we help them maximize the revenue they can earn by serving acceptable ads to users of ad blocking software who've opted in to receive them. We can do that with the publisher's own programmatic and direct demand, with our demand, or most lucratively by using a combination of the two. And just about the company, we're a little over 5 years old. We've been growing over 100% year over year since we launched this product. And our team of 30 includes, an all-star cast who've spent time at top ad tech companies like Magnite, AppNexus, Index Exchange, OpenX, et cetera.
Cool. And so now for a question about you and your media habits. So before the show, I shared with you eMarketer's estimates of average media consumption among US adults. Can you share with listeners somewhere you either over-index or under-index, somewhere you're just a little bit of an outlier compared to the typical US adult?
Yeah, for sure. So I think there are two places where I'm definitely an outlier in consuming less than the average bear. One is in terms of social. So I used to be a very avid consumer of social, especially of Facebook. But something happened like 5 or 6 years ago that made me just totally lose interest. If I recall correctly, that there was this time where Facebook just started going nuts with the notifications. They'd notify you about everything and everything.
They were a little thirsty.
They were thirsty, exactly. And when somebody's acting thirsty, it kind of turns you off. So I turned off the notifications and I just kind of forgot about the app. And so today, my only social consumption is for work, a couple minutes a day of Twitter, or maybe 15, 20 minutes on LinkedIn. And I just never got into the Gram or Snap or TikTok or any of that stuff.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I've mentioned on a couple of past episodes, I'm definitely an under-indexer for social. I totally remember exactly what you're talking about with the Facebook notifications. Mm-hmm. They would be emailing you with your friend commented on some random post, please come see it, right? Yeah. And it was okay, time to turn off all notifications.
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
At least that was my response.
Yeah. And then I mentioned TV as well. I first started using the web in 98 when I was 12 years old. And I quickly learned that there were ways of downloading whatever content you wanted for free and without programming schedules or needing to sit through commercials every 10 minutes. So unless I wanted to watch something live like a sports game, I just never considered linear TV to be a good way to consume content. And then when I moved out for college, it just didn't make sense to pay money for cable to see the occasional hockey game or whatever. So my linear TV consumption basically went to zero the moment I moved out of my parents' place.
Yeah, that's happened to many, many people, of course. So getting into the main part of the show now, let's talk a little bit about kind of the history of ad blocking. So last month in May, Blockthrough released the 2021 edition of the PageFair Ad Block Report, which has been coming out for many years and which has tracked the popularity of ad blocking. So I feel like ad blocking is something where there was a huge amount of industry chatter a few years ago, which has died down a little bit since then, but ad blocking hasn't actually gone away, right? So can you outline sort of a brief history of ad blocking for listeners?
For sure. That's a very, I think, accurate and succinct way of describing it. To dive a little deeper, I think you have to go back to 2015, which was sort of like the start of the ad blocking hype cycle. It was the year that Blockthrough got started. And, if I recall correctly, we had something like 30 other competitors who started that year. And that batch of companies, ourselves included, we sort of became what I would call the first generation of ad blocking solutions. So these were solutions that just candidly weren't doing a great job of solving the problem. And that's true of us at the time as well. There were, two sorts of categories of companies in this first generation of solutions. So you had companies like Blockthrough, who, at the time we were trying to deliver ads by circumventing or bypassing ad blockers. And then you had another category of solutions that were more messaging oriented. They were loading pop-ups, or prompts that basically asked or forced the user to whitelist the site or disable their ad blocker. And ultimately, neither of these two types of solutions really generated meaningful revenue for publishers. Ad block circumvention was a cat and mouse game, and frankly, it didn't really work with programmatic in a way that generated meaningful CPMs for publishers. And the messaging solutions are sort of inherently annoying. Ad block users download ad blockers to avoid annoyance, and showing a pop-up to a user who's sensitive to annoying experiences to say, please turn off your ad blocker, is not well received generally. So, as you probably saw in the report, about 70% of ad block users bounce when they get that message. And that means that you just can't monetize most users through that mechanism. So despite that, a lot of these were getting publisher adoption because publishers were, to use your terminology, thirsty. And they just weren't seeing great results, despite the fact that ad blocking was still growing, on desktop through 2017 when it sort of plateaued, and on mobile even through today. Now, the period of, just to kind of get to the next chapter of the story, the period of mid-2017 through the end of 2018 was sort of a quiet breakthrough in the ad blocking world. So 2017 was the year that AdBlock Plus, which had originally created the acceptable ad standard almost 10 years ago, had relinquished control over it to an independent nonprofit called the Acceptable Ads Committee. So this was a committee that was basically, governed by volunteers from across different parts of the industry with some user representation as well. And basically, alongside handing this over to an independent committee, AdBlock Plus opened it up for third-party companies to come in and innovate on top of acceptable ads. Now, we at the time were frankly not doing very well because AdBlock circumvention, just didn't work. And so we found ourselves in a spot where we were, examining what's another way to solve this problem. And we stumbled onto acceptable ads. We felt it was aligned with our values of monetizing ad block users in a way that they're okay with, in a way that's sustainable. And what we saw is that while AdBlock Plus had a lot of success getting, the walled gardens to, basically pay them to serve acceptable ads to their users. So, they had Google as a customer, Amazon as a customer, LinkedIn, a bunch of other walled gardens. They basically had virtually no success amongst independent publishers in the open web at the time. And so we sort of looked at that and we tried to understand, why is that? Maybe there's an opportunity there for an independent player like us to help. And what we found is that whereas walled gardens have, large engineering teams and total control of their ad stack, most independent publishers have neither of those things. They're wholly reliant on third-party ad tech, and they're usually strapped for resources. So, when you looked at the ad tech they were using, there was no button a publisher could press that could only deliver acceptable ads to those users who were running an ad blocker and opted in. And we looked at that and thought we could build that button. So, with very little cash left in the bank, we took, Prebid, the open source header bidding framework. We built our own proprietary ad filtering technology on top of it. And in March of 2018, we launched a product that was basically able to monetize those users who are opted into acceptable ads, which are about 80-ish% of the publisher's ad block traffic, with the publisher's existing programmatic or direct demand. So we launched that in March of 2018. When we launched it, we had like 29 days of cash left in the bank. So this was our Hail Mary pass. And it's worked wildly well, gone from 0 to over 3 million a month recovered for our publishers, over $50 million recovered for our publishers over the last 3 years. So that's sort of, to take the Blockthrough out of the story for a second, that's sort of when we entered the second generation of solutions, which were solutions that were built on top of acceptable ads, which allowed a publisher to monetize the vast majority of their ad block users who are okay with advertising, but aren't okay with annoying advertising or, advertising with malware or whatever it might be. So that's sort of, a brief history of ad block monetization solutions. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Definitely makes sense. And I mean, I think, I've been following this space for basically all of that time period. Definitely fits in with how I kind of remember things evolving, and probably also some people's consumer experiences, encountering these solutions as well, right? You mentioned a couple of times like annoyance as the big reason why ad blocking users are ad blocking users. Let's talk a little bit about this consumer attitude side a little bit more. Again, just based on my past research into this area, most of these users aren't necessarily like opposed to advertising in principle. They don't say, I don't believe in advertising, I never want to see an ad. They have a problem instead with the specific ways they experience digital ads, which is annoying in many cases, right? So
Yep.
Is that also what you found? And does that continue to be the case? What's motivating these people who block ads?
That's absolutely correct. And we see a few statistics that back this up. So number one, plugging our ad block report from our own survey data, which, was published in that report, we found that annoying experiences are indeed the top driver of ad blocking. About 81% of ad block users state that this is a major motivation for downloading ad blocking. Reasons number 2 and 3, down at around 60%, are malware and privacy. And, those are being dealt with by other solutions in the market these days. But annoyance is really the top one. The second statistic that we see, or data point that we see, is that this same survey that we ran, we also asked the ad block, self-reported ad block users, what percentage of them are, willing to accept light, non-intrusive ads. And what we saw in that survey was about 63% of ad block users say yes. That's consistent with what we see in our own internal traffic data. So we track what percentage of ad block users we see acceptable ads on. And we see about 70 to 80% of the users that, have ad blockers on are allowing acceptable ads. And then the third data point that we think is interesting is that if you look at the ad blockers that support acceptable ads, so not all of those ad blockers in that 70 to 80% support acceptable ads, but if you look at just the ones who do support it, their opt-out rates are extremely low, usually around 6 to 8%. So what we see is that if an ad blocker adopts acceptable ads as the default, about 92 to 94% of users leave it on because they're not that bothered by the experience.
Yeah. Interesting. And now, aside from the acceptable ads, have you encountered any difference in like how annoying the typical ad is? Have people become any less likely to use an ad blocker to begin with because experiences are getting better? Or is that like completely not happening?
I think there are a couple of data points that sort of indicated that might be happening. And then we're starting to see some data points that indicate maybe it wasn't. So, the CBA has been working very hard, doing, I think, some good work over the last several years, trying to clean up the like non-ad block ad experience so that people aren't as motivated to use ad blockers. And I think they have done some things that are good for the web in terms of improving ad experiences. We did see a plateauing of desktop ad blocking from 2017 onwards. So it hasn't gone down to any meaningful extent. There have been ticks down, ticks up, but it stayed pretty stable. Mobile ad blocking has continued to rise pretty rapidly, largely driven by mobile browsers that support ad blocking as a feature, either by default or as a feature that can be enabled. And I think, so while there was that sort of plateauing in desktop ad blocking, what we're seeing in the latest ad block report that we published, when we ask a US user, an internet user, whether or not they use an ad blocker, 40% say yes. And that's drastically higher than drastically higher than what we see when our code is running on page. And it's drastically higher than that desktop ad blocking number that looked plateaued. And so we tried to understand why this could be. And we sort of arrived at two causes, which I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think there's a bit of both. I think number one, generally when you ask people to use an ad blocker, I think you get a little bit of over-reporting. You get some people who don't know what you mean, or they'll say, oh yeah, I use the Chrome ad blocker, which isn't really a true ad blocker. So I think there is a little bit of like over self-reporting, but of the 40, about 35 of the 40% can actually name the ad blocker they use. And, that's still a really big delta. So what we think is happening based on the survey results is that you're starting to see a rise in ad blocking that doesn't use the easy list block list. If you look at our old methodology, which was driving, that graph, which plateaued in 2017, that was all using easy list downloads. And you now have a greater variety in types of ad blockers. You have AdGuard, which uses, which uses its own set of lists. You have Brave, which uses a variation of Easy List. You have uBlock Origin. You have all sorts of variation. And what we think is happening is there's you're starting to see a larger percentage of ad blockers than, 3 or 4 years ago that are blocking the technologies that actually detect that they're there.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's really interesting and important for people to understand, because as you say, the rates did, appear to plateau at a certain point. One thing I also recall from a few years ago, at least, is that on mobile, there was a great difficulty in blocking in-app ads, which is the majority of mobile ads. Has that changed at all? Are people more able to block ads in-app as well as in browsers?
It remains difficult. So basically what happened there is you had Google and Apple take aggressive policy stances and basically say you can't block in-app because, it'll impact our app store environments and, we don't want that. So basically, while it is technically feasible to do, any app that, starts doing it that gets enough uptake to get on their radars just gets kicked out of the store. There are ways to do it if you root or jailbreak your phone or download something that's off market, but not a lot of users do that. So in-app ad blocking has never really taken off to the extent that it could if it were allowed.
Yeah. All right, cool. We're going to be back in a minute to talk more about how publishers and advertisers have responded to ad blocking. But first, a quick break with a message from our sponsor, VTEX. Retail's next competitive threat may come from a business model or channel that didn't even exist a few months ago. This modern dynamic requires companies to adapt quickly, pivoting business seemingly overnight, something traditional commerce platforms just can't support. There's a new enterprise commerce platform on the rise, one that's fast, flexible, and doesn't require 9 months and $1 million to get up and running. Go to VTEX, VTEX.com/eMarketer to learn more. Okay, cool. So I'm back now with Marty to talk more about how publishers and advertisers have responded to the ad blocking situation. And let's start with publishers. Now, you talked earlier about how they've kind of migrated from primarily a strategy of just hassling people to turn their ad blockers off to monetizing those users with acceptable ads. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of how that monetization effort is going? And also, what are acceptable ads? What kinds of ads are they successfully serving these users?
Yeah, so I'll start with the second question. So, what are acceptable ads? Acceptable ads in principle are ads that, are light enough that an ad block user is willing to accept them. So if you go to acceptableadscommittee.org, you can see a comprehensive breakdown of what exactly is allowed, what's not, to dive into some of the granulars. So, on desktop, you're not allowed animated ads. You're not allowed, video ads that don't have a play button that auto, jump straight into the video or the audio. In addition to that, there's requirements around how much of the screen real estate can be taken up by ads. There's provisions around what types of ads are allowed in content or in feed. But basically, it's, a nice light experience that when tested in, the studies that we've done, over at the Acceptable Ads Committee, I should, taking off my Blockthrough hat for a second. I also volunteer over at the Acceptable Ads Committee. And so basically over at the Acceptable Ads Committee, we run research whenever we're creating a new standard. So we created the mobile web standard back in, I can't remember if it was 2017 or 2018, around that timeline we launched it. We basically ran a comprehensive study around all sorts of different ad formats. And basically what we needed was at least 70% of ad block users in the study to say, yes, I'm willing to accept this ad, or it's not annoying, it's not interruptive. And so as the web evolves, we check in on, new edge cases, new types of ad formats that didn't exist when the original studies were done. We'll run new studies against those formats, or, new environments like mobile web that, was up and coming in 2017, 2018. We did a whole bunch of studies around that. So that's broadly what an acceptable ad is. Again, the exhaustive list is at acceptableadscommittee.org. The first part of your question, which was
how is it going for publishers monetizing through acceptable ads?
Yeah, so I can say, there's a few comments I can make there. Obviously, our business is built on top of acceptable ads. And so, our customers are seeing some great results. We have some case studies that we did with Healthline. I believe we have another one coming out with AccuWeather. And those studies showcase like how an individual publisher has done. On a broader sort of macro level, for our latest report and the year before, we did an analysis of what publishers are doing to monetize ad block users these days. And I think that's probably the most indicative of how much success publishers are having. What we see, or what we saw in the analysis that we did, is that today 52 of the top 100 publishers in the US monetize with some variation of acceptable ads. So they might be working directly with the ad blockers in the case of a Google, or if they're an independent publisher that's not a walled garden, they're probably working with either a specialized vendor like a Blockthrough, or with somebody like a Taboola or an Outbrain or a Criteo, which has their own sort of acceptable ad solution for their own demand. So 52 of the top 100 publishers are using acceptable ads today. That's compared to about 20 publishers who are still using some kind of messaging of the top 100, and just one publisher, Facebook, who's still doing ad block circumvention. So as you can see, ad block circumvention has really died out in North America. And the messaging solutions have less than half the adoption as acceptable ads these days.
Yeah, I have to say, I think that's incredibly interesting. Again, as someone who was covering this space kind of up until a couple of years ago, I think there was just a lot more optimism around the prompts and the ad block walls and even around circumvention of the ad blocking solutions in the marketplace at that time. And I think there was quite a bit of skepticism about ideas like acceptable ads and finding other ways to monetize those users that didn't bother the user. So I find it really interesting how much that's shifted.
Agreed.
Yeah. Now, let's talk a little bit about the advertiser side as well. It's funny that you just mentioned that Facebook is the only major publisher in the US that's still doing circumvention. I remember years ago when I talked to people on the buy side about whether they were concerned about ad blocking, they would tell me, no, because I can still reach all of those users on Facebook. No big deal. Very interesting approach to messaging people. But how would you say that advertisers should be thinking now about what they can do to reach ad blocking users? Should they be trying to reach them? Should they be trying something better than, I'll just get them at Facebook where they can't get away from me?
That's hilarious. I actually haven't heard that one.
I've heard that many times.
Interesting. That's great. So you're right. Advertisers have been quite laissez-faire. I wasn't aware of that reason. There are two other reasons why I've sort of seen it in my conversations with advertisers. I think a lot of advertisers haven't really, thought about how should I be solving for this? Because it doesn't directly impact their bottom line. It's a problem of lost supply for publishers, but advertisers aren't losing money when somebody blocks an ad for the most part. And so, there just wasn't a large financial incentive for them to do anything about it other than continue buying at Facebook, apparently. The second piece is I think some buyers have a misconception around why ad block users block ads. They think that ad block users use on a certain level, it feels intuitive. Ad block users don't want to see ads. That's why they're blocking them. But, when you dig deeper and look at the data of what users say about it, it's clear that it's much more nuanced than that. And so I think the answer is absolutely they should be trying to address those ad block users who have opted into acceptable ads. They're high value, tech savvy users who, buy a lot online. They're hard to reach, other than on Facebook. They're not, they haven't been omnipresent on the web until acceptable ads started to take off. And they're totally fine with being advertised to as long as the ads aren't annoying. So, we have ways that advertisers can get in front of these users using the existing buying channels they use, using their existing DSPs. So advertisers are more than welcome to reach out to us at Blockthrough. But yeah, that's sort of my thesis on it.
Yeah, well, and that was actually one of the things that I was going to ask as a follow-up is what do advertisers need to do? What do they need to consider or think about if they want to start using acceptable ads and they don't already?
Yeah, it's a great question. The most important nuances about acceptable ads are that video ads are rated consistently by ad block users the most annoying. So as an advertiser, you can't reach ad block users via video unless it's on Facebook. And I guarantee you the user's not going to enjoy it. So display is really the primary channel through which to reach these users. Because animated ads are generally not allowed, there's a couple of edge cases where they are, but because they're not allowed, we recommend advertisers do run some campaigns with either static ads that don't animate or with at least a static image backup, which certain technologies can access the static image backup if they know it's an acceptable ads user. So that's sort of the easiest, most seamless way to access the audience. And again, if somebody wants to learn more, contact at blockthrough.com.
Nice. Yeah. Well, your point about video is really funny. Listeners of the show might have heard me talk in the past. I've said this so many times. Advertisers love video so much. They've wanted for decades now to turn the internet into television because of how much they love video ads. And I'm a person who hates video. I hate video ads. Totally sympathize with the idea that video is the most annoying thing on the internet.
I'm right there with you. And I think, it's kind of, I'm going to get philosophical for a second. I think like there's a really fine line between engagement and annoyance. Like they're almost the same thing. And I think advertisers care a lot about engagement, and they haven't historically been forced to think about, where does that fine line become annoyance?
Yeah,
but clearly you and I think about it all day.
We do. We sure do. And thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about it. Unfortunately, that's all that we have time for on today's episode of the Behind the Numbers ad platform, an eMarketer podcast made possible by VTEX. Marty, thank you so much for chatting today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thanks to all of you for listening. I'll be back next week with the next episode of the ad platform. And in the meantime, please continue to let us know what you think at podcast@emarketer.com. Thanks.